Welcome everyone to part one, Introduction to ADA, what it means for AEL providers. Our guest presenter today is Mr. Diego Dimaya. He has a Juris Doctorate and he is the Executive Director of Technical Assistance for the Southwest ADA Center. He's joined today by his colleague Marissa Dimaya, and she is also going to start us off. So at this time, I am going to unmute Marissa first. And here we go. Marissa, you are unmuted, and then I'm also going to unmute Diego. So Marissa, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne Marie. Thank you, everyone, for inviting us to do this for you all today. Just very briefly, my name is Marissa Dimaya. I am with the Southwest ADA Center here in Houston, Texas. Just very briefly about our center, we are one of 10 centers across the United States that is federally funded. That's your tax dollars at work. Federally funded to provide you with information, technical assistance, and resources regarding your rights and responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. A little bit about what we do. We have a toll-free number that people can call, and Diego will probably shamelessly plug that a little bit here towards the end of our presentation. We have a toll-free number that anyone can call when they have a question regarding their rights, or they want to discuss an issue, they want to get more information. Our job is to talk to you about these issues and give you some good information, some resources that you can consult so that you can make an informed decision about whatever it is that's going on related to your rights under the ADA. I'm going to turn it over now to one of my favorite people, our Technical Assistance Director, Diego Dimaya. Diego?
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody can hear me. And yes, this is Diego Dimaya, and that picture you saw there, that's the ugly geezer. That's me. Somehow I was wearing a suit that day. Go figure. But anyway, thank you for joining once again. So I'm going to get started right away. I am an attorney by training, and basically I consider myself to be an ADA nerd, and I specialize in labor law, ADA matters, all types of matters regarding the ADA, including employment accommodations, education accommodations, architectural accessibility, and so forth about the ADA in relation to the ADA. And then the presentation today, of course, is introductory. I want to point out that I made it fairly dense. I did that on purpose because Anne Marie told me that this would make the material in here will be made available for people to have and to forever cherish and use. And I hope that's the case. If you need more clarification, you can certainly contact us directly, and that's information will be available. And then the PowerPoint, I did it fairly dense. Typically, you see just a few bullet points in most PowerPoints. That's what they usually recommend. People who work on presentations. But I did this because I wanted it to serve as a resource and not just merely a PowerPoint with bullets on it. At least I wanted to at least give you some kind of reference point where you can look things up, including the actual legal requirements if you want to do such a thing as reading a regulation or Title II or Title III of the ADA. Okay, so we move along to the slide Empower Your Adults who are participating in literacy programs. And I put this in here because it's really important that we give people a chance who are participating in educational programs, any kind of educational program. It doesn't have to be adult literacy. It can be any kind. And that we, send a message that people need to come forward and ask for whatever accommodations they might need, that, so long as they're reasonable and that would allow them to participate equally and fairly, in the courses. But also the fact that people will, especially adults, will expect to be reasonably accommodated. They are used to. We are, entering, in 2018 now. We are used to having an ADA law for many years, over 25 years. And so people expect to be reasonably accommodated because they're not going to be so bashful as they used to be in disclosing a disability, which is a topic we'll talk about more later during our third webinar in terms of disability information disclosures. So moving on to slide, what is that, 7? Reason to accommodate adults. I think those are fairly obvious. I think that, again, people expect to be reasonably accommodated because, it's really unlikely that they will be exaggerating anything that's not a disability and calling it a disability. Most people who disclose a disability usually think about it very carefully, and then they come forward and say, hey, I have a situation where I have a learning disability. It takes me longer to process, text material. For instance, they might have dyslexia, and so it's a good idea, to accommodate individuals with disabilities to the best of our abilities as people who teach courses or who run special programs for adults. And I think that if we go to the next slide, I mentioned that many adults have learning disabilities, and it's important to realize a lot of people, still really do not disclose having a learning disability. I think people are coming forward a lot more often now, and statistics and analysis and research data seems to show that, especially adults are becoming a lot more forward about, disclosing having a disability, such as dyslexia or an attention deficit disorder. And so they might be requesting from an adult literacy program, they might be requesting a quiet testing room. If the literacy program administers examinations or quizzes, they might be requesting different types of accommodations, including extended testing time, for example. So we go to the next slide, and of course that's the slide about the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is the law. So we start talking about the law now. And what you should know basically is the ADA has 3 key titles. Title I prohibits discrimination on the basis of, prohibits discrimination in employment. And then, of course, Title II prohibits discrimination by public entities. That would be your local and state government agencies, programs of government agencies, and which will include colleges, universities, adult literacy programs, anything that's run by a state or a public entity such as a local high school or a locally government-funded center, then all those activities are covered by Title II of the ADA. And then, of course, Title III of the ADA covers private entities, and that includes your typical businesses like restaurants and movie theaters and private schools, both primary education and secondary education, as well as any type of nonprofit organization are covered as public accommodations. So try to remember, public entity means government entity, right? A government agency such as a local public school or a school district or a community college. So that's a public entity. And then you have public accommodations, which are basically private businesses, including nonprofit organizations. For instance, the Red Cross is a nonprofit public accommodation. So slide, let's see, slide.
Yeah, I think
Slide 10, I believe, is Title II, correct?
Yes, Title II, state and local government entities.
Yeah. So here you have, where the law is, this is where we get more detail. how the ADA obligates Title II entities to provide accommodations and to not discriminate against the people they serve on the basis of disability. And so generally speaking, we can pretty much, gloss over this, and there's not too much that we can discuss in depth here, only that, it's not easy to remember any of this, and I encourage people to either look this up online or to basically download many of the various publications available about the ADA and Title II entities if they want to have a lot more detail on file for their own referral purposes, or you can just use this PowerPoint once it gets uploaded to the location where participants today will be able to obtain it. So moving on to
Title III.
Title III. Thank you. Sorry, my slide was getting stuck there. Okay, so again, we have Title III of the ADA, public accommodations, which covers your private businesses, including nonprofit organizations, as I mentioned. And a lot of calls that we get at the ADA Center, believe it or not, relate to public accommodations, Title III entities versus entities that may not necessarily be covered by the ADA or that might be exempt from coverage under the ADA. So an example of that would be a strictly church-run organization. If it is strictly church-run and it is open for church members, it is typically exempt from ADA compliance. Now, once the church organization opens up to the public and makes it, turns whatever program it is into a public accommodation, meaning that anyone can come and use and participate in their services, even if they charge fees, then that opens it up to being a public accommodation covered by Title III of the ADA. But to be detailed about this, remember this: if you or anyone has any doubts about whether or not their private entity is covered by the ADA, and especially because there's a religious component in the mix, then you need to consult with us, because there is a definite test, a set of factors and rules or elements that must be met before a private entity can be deemed as being exempt from ADA compliance. Okay, and we can get that to you offline. You can ask more details about that. And then I also want to mention that in the state of Texas, churches are not entirely exempt from ADA type of compliance, and that arena has to do with the architectural accessibility of newly constructed or altered churches. And so, for example, when a church alters its worship area where everybody congregates, for worship, they're required to make those areas accessible for people with disabilities, essentially, make it accessible for people with mobility impairments and so forth, okay? And that, of course, would include their public bathrooms, as well as their parking lots outside of the church. So in Texas, churches are generally speaking covered by the Texas law, in that they have to comply with architectural error removal and new construction requirements. And that's enforced by the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. If anyone is curious, you can look it up. And they do have a division which deals strictly the enforcement of the Texas Architectural Barriers Act. Okay, that's not on the slides. I'm just kind of throwing that out there in case anybody's curious about how that would work, okay? Because we do get a lot of questions at the ADA Center on the 800 line, that people asking, is our organization covered or not? And we get questions, believe it or not, we get questions that relate to educational programs in many, many instances. Not necessarily adult literacy programs, but other types of educational programs, like for children, for example, who participate in church-oriented activities. We get a lot of phone calls from parents who want to know whether or not the church that they're attending would have to comply with an ADA requirement. So as you can see, the nonprofit sector, private business sector, is a little bit more complex. It gets more in depth into what's covered and what's not covered. And the only other exception I can think of is also private clubs. Okay, so private clubs in general tend to be exempt from ADA compliance. But once again, when you start thinking about the fact that most entities, whether profit or nonprofit, including private clubs, tend to want to welcome people rather than exclude them or leave them excluded, most of them tend to comply with the ADA voluntarily, and that's kind of been a given nationwide. Very seldom will you find a private type of entity that's just basically decided to not make itself accessible, to welcome it, even its paid private membership. So this is kind of what's been happening in the world of ADA in terms of so many years having gone by, that the ADA has become sort of a ubiquitous part of life, essentially, saying that people with disabilities are part of the human experience. And gosh, I think the last time I read the statistics, there's something in the order of 60 to 70 million people in the United States that are considered to have some kind of disability or another, whether disclosed or not. That's treated differently, but they estimate somewhere in the 60 to 70 million. Okay, so we go to the integration requirement slide. Slide 12, I believe. So integration is really important to talk about, at least briefly, because I want people to understand that even in situations where an entity may not be able to afford making itself accessible to people with disabilities, they still have to try to make their best to integrate people with disabilities into their programs rather than segregating them or excluding them or sending them to go and attend a different program, or rather the same program possibly held at a different location because it might be more accessible. Now, I'm going to talk more about that as we get through the illustrations that we have coming up. But I wanted people to make sure that they understood, the contents of this slide in terms of what integration means, because it's a really important component of the ADA. Essentially, the mission, the underlying theme of the ADA is that people with disabilities be integrated to society, and that's why I put that in here. Now, the next slide, which I titled the ADA and Contracts versus Grants. Okay, I wanted to put this up front and center right away, rather than waiting until later, where we will touch this topic one more time before we close for today. Oh, and I wanted to remind both Anne-Marie and Marissa to please remind me of our time and to time me, because I tend to just kind of ramble on, and I apologize I have time for that. So at least if you guys can tell me, that we're 45 minutes into the presentation, or at least 1 hour into, then I will have a good measuring to, kind of start tempering myself here.
We're good. We're 22 minutes in, so we're doing
okay,
good.
Thank you. So on this particular slide, I wanted people to understand that there is a tension between government entities that put out for, contractors to bid for projects, okay? And this is very, very common. I mean, this is a very common occurrence. Government entities contract all the time with private organizations and private companies, both for profit and nonprofit organizations. And so, I mean, a typical, road construction company will go and bid for contracts to do road work for a city. This is a very typical type of situation. There's nothing new here. What needs to be understood is that the public entity, the government entity who's giving out the contract, essentially has to make sure that the services that they're contracting out for a private entity to provide need to be compliant with any applicable ADA type of obligations, which could include architectural barrier removal, or it could include making an educational program accessible. It could include making a nursing home accessible, as we'll see in the upcoming illustrations. And so that's kind of what this slide is about. I wanted people to understand the connection between a private entity and a government entity, and where that connection meets, and where it meets, where it hits the road, as it were. And in terms of grants and private entities that apply for grants, essentially it's a very similar approach, although a grant is not a contract, okay? A grant, kind of may look like a contract, because essentially what it is the organization promises to do certain things, or proposes to do certain things, or provide services or work on certain projects on behalf of the entity who's giving them the money to do so. And that could be something as simple as conducting surveys, or it could be something like providing and facilitating an adult literacy program, okay? And the difference might be that in a contract, there could be language that says, for example, something very general. There might be a clause that says that the contractor will abide by any and all applicable laws, including federal laws. And so, of course, you have to realize that would include the ADA, which is a federal statute, okay? Just like the Civil Rights of 1964, just like OSHA laws, or, any other type of federally imposed laws that companies have to abide by whenever those laws apply to them or their employees or their activities, okay? And so the same thing basically applies to grants and people who use grants provided through who use money provided through government grants. They essentially, while the language may not necessarily be in there, the public entity still has to make sure that their activities, including those monies that they give out to organizations as grants, they have to make sure that those activities are done in a lawful fashion, carried out in a legally compliant fashion with any applicable laws. And so, especially when it comes to providing a grant for the private entity to provide an educational program, for example, right, then you're going to have a situation where the public entity is going to make sure, it is obligated to make sure that the educational program being provided by the private entity is compliant with accessibility requirements, accommodation requirements, and the effective communication requirements, as you will see. So here we go with the illustration 1, and I'm going to have, I believe, Marissa read the illustration 1.
All right, thank you. So illustration 1, State Agency Z oversees adult literacy programs in facilities across the state. The adult literacy classes are administered and run by X, a private nonprofit adult literacy organization, through a grant provided by State Agency Z. As a public accommodation, X nonprofit is subject to Title III of the ADA. State Agency Z is a Title II public entity. State Agency Z is obligated to ensure that the adult literacy program run by X nonprofit will be operated in a manner consistent with Title II obligations, even if X nonprofit is not directly subject to Title II.
Okay. So if you look at this fact pattern, or situational pattern or scenario, okay, don't get caught up with the letters, Z and X, okay? Just think of a public entity basically doing business with a private entity, okay? And it's exactly what I was talking about. Essentially, the public entity has to make sure that the private organization or the private business complies with applicable, and you heard it right, applicable Title II obligations. Now, why is that? Because people will say, well, Title II doesn't apply to a private organization or a business, okay? Sure, private entities, any private business or nonprofit, they have to comply with Title III of the ADA as a public accommodation, okay? So, but what happens is that because the public entity is actually putting itself out there in terms of giving a grant or granting a contract for a private organization to perform, well, its public obligation is to make sure that it abides with all applicable laws in terms of how it's handling those funds, those monies, how they're going to be spent. And so they have to be spent in a manner compliant with all applicable laws. And of course, that's going to include the ADA, as well as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act if the public entity is using federal funds in order to grant, to give grants or to grant contracts to private contractors. Okay, so I'm thinking that this is fairly clear for now, at least, and that people understand that there is a definite connection. And even if there's, and I'll say this later on again, even if there's no language in the contract or grant paperwork that says such a thing, the public entity remains obligated nevertheless to make sure that the private entity or the private business complies with all applicable ADA obligations. And, really, once we go through the rest of the slides, you're going to realize that the requirements in terms of providing reasonable accommodations and auxiliary aids and services to the students of adult literacy programs are not all that different from one another. They're pretty much the same thing, whether it's a public entity like a community college providing the program or whether it's a nonprofit. The requirements are pretty much the same. Okay, so we move on to the next one.
Oh, Diego.
Yes.
Could you, we had a couple of latecomers. Could you go over that just one more time again about what Title II ensures briefly?
Are you referring to which slide?
Let's, Diego, this is Anne Marie. Let's just go over just briefly what Title II covers in general, since we talked about that at the very beginning, and we had people come in late.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, sure. Well, basically, Title II is the part of the ADA. It's the title that covers or obligates, you could say, public entities such as local government agencies, and or a community college or a state university. Those are Title II covered entities, and the essential requirements are that they cannot discriminate against the people they serve on the basis of disabilities. That would be students or participants in any type of educational program, whether credit or no credit or vocational training program. They cannot discriminate on the basis of disabilities. And the other part of that is that they have to provide reasonable accommodations for participants with disabilities who make a request, as well as facilitating what's known as effective communication, which comes up in the slides later, essentially for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, or people who are blind, or people who might have a speech impediment. So anyone with a sensory type of impairment who would require an accommodation because they can't communicate due to a disability, the public entity would have to reasonably accommodate and provide an auxiliary aid. An auxiliary aid can include a sign language interpreter or a closed captioning, or it could be some other type of accommodation, including taking notes on behalf of someone who's unable to take notes.
Thank you, Diego.
Sure.
We'll go to slide 15 now.
Okay, so illustration 2.
Right.
A nonprofit corporation operates a number of group homes under contract with a state agency for individuals with mental disabilities. The homes provide social services and are places of public accommodation covered by Title III. The state agency must ensure that its contracts are carried out in accordance with Title II, and the private entity must ensure that the homes comply with Title III. Even in the absence of contract or grant compliance language, a state agency is still required to monitor contractor and or grantee Title II compliance.
I forgot I actually put that in there. So you see this tension here, okay? We do get questions at the ADA Center about this. I'm calling it a tension only because a lot of organizations, both on the government side as well as on the business side, from time to time forget this requirement. And it doesn't necessarily make anybody liable, it doesn't necessarily make anybody prone to being sued. It's just that what happens is that there might be a slight difference in how the government entity chooses to enforce its ADA obligations and how the private business or private nonprofit organization chooses to enforce or to comply with its Title III ADA obligations. So there might be some differences there. The differences could be that maybe the private nonprofit organization is on a shoestring budget and is having a real hard time, providing a sign language interpreter, say for 5 classes, one time per day every week, and so that might be terribly expensive for them to do. But if it would be, for example, a nonprofit the size of the Red Cross, for example, then it would be more difficult for them to justify an undue burden on their operations or a fundamental alteration because they're having to spend so much money to accommodate an individual who is deaf. Okay, and I'm only just selecting the deafness disability as an example, as I could choose any other type of disability. But essentially, that's the tension that we have here. And I just wanted people to understand again that the language, that the contract language or grant language does not necessarily have to reflect that this connection between a public government entity and a private business will exist once they contract with one another or once the public entity gives a grant of money to a private nonprofit. Okay, so this obligation is like an ongoing obligation. And if you want to read more about it, you can go to either of the United States Department of Justice Technical Assistance Manuals. They refers to them as TAMs. And basically, you can look those up online. They're readily available. Now, they're old and outdated, but the content of the manuals is really quite, serves as really good guidance, especially with the examples and illustrations. In fact, I want to tell everyone here that the majority of the illustrations you're seeing here is basically me borrowing from those technical assistance manuals and just kind of changing a few words here and there. But other than that, the contents is exactly, it's very similar. So slide 16, reasonable accommodations. So as you can see, reasonable accommodations applies to whether the provider of the educational program is a public entity or a private one. It really makes no difference. The reasonable accommodations have to be provided once a student comes forward and makes a request. Okay, so this is fairly straightforward, and you can see the extent of the type of accommodations. As we go along into our next webinars, you'll know more about the types of accommodations that might tend to be reasonable versus those that might tend to be more unreasonable or more costly and therefore perhaps more prohibitive, that would require an organization to say, okay, we can't provide that accommodation, but we can try to do something different, to try to help the person get through the program. So now we go on to illustration 3.
All right, illustration 3. A community college makes available free adult literacy classes via an AEL grant throughout its several campuses for eligible adults. Yet the application process is complex and lengthy. When some individuals with mental disabilities apply to enroll, they're unable to complete the application process successfully. Consequently, they're effectively denied access to the free program. In this case, the college is obligated to make reasonable modifications to its application process and ensure that otherwise eligible individuals are not excluded. Modifications to the AEL program might include simplifying the application process or providing applicants who have mental disabilities with individualized assistance to complete the process.
So here you're seeing a typical situation that concerns making a reasonable accommodation in the form of changing the application procedure or the process so that people with whatever types of disabilities, might be preventing them from participating in the application process. Notice how this is all about participation and inclusion. Okay? It's really important to keep that in mind because people with disabilities, they're essentially seeking to have equal participation, regardless of what the activity is. Even something as commonsensical to everyone as the application or filling out a form to participate in an adult education program. Okay, so you see where this accommodation would become necessary for someone who cannot complete the paperwork, or who might be unable to use the online application process to apply to participate in the program. Even in this day and age of advanced technologies and smartphones and screen readers that read the screen out to blind people when they're navigating websites, we need to understand, realize that not everyone will be able to participate. Not everyone will be capable of using advanced technologies. Maybe the technology is not available. Maybe it's unaffordable to the individual. Whatever the case may be, they still have this disability that prevents them from participating. And so the ADA requires that the entities and private organizations facilitate the reasonable accommodation without regard to any type of mitigating measure that might be available out there, like a computer equipped with a screen reader, just to keep it simple. And so that's what this is about, okay? And I'm kind of emphasizing on it, staying on it, because it's really important that people understand that many people essentially will go online to apply for a service and eventually just give up halfway through it because they can't handle, for whatever disability they might have, they can't handle getting through the process. And the majority of times that I have learned about this occurring has to do with people who have learning disabilities or cognitive impairments. People who are on the autism spectrum but who are quite functional and communicative, nonetheless might have difficulty navigating a website. Other people might be unable to write. They may not have use of their hands. They can't write because they're blind or visually impaired, or they can't use their hands, and so they cannot fill out actual paperwork forms, paper printed forms, for example. But they might also be unable to go use a computer for that matter, which means that they will be walking into an office and requesting the accommodation directly, either from the registrar or from someone at the school or someone running the program. So don't be surprised when you get these kinds of requests, which might seem so simple. It might seem like, well, why can't you get through that? I mean, it's so simple. Sure, it might be simple, but not for everybody. So just kind of keep that in mind. And, keep also in mind that even when people might have the type of disabilities that prevent them from doing something like filling out a form, that does not mean that they cannot participate in an educational program. It does not mean that at all. So keep in mind that disabilities come in very, very different varieties. And I also want to emphasize that each individual who approaches a faculty member or a teacher or a program manager for a request and accommodation, each case must be treated individually, and each case must be interactively dealt with the person. And, we listen for the person's preferences and what they're asking for, and then we make a determination whether what they're asking for is fundamentally altering. In other words, it'll be so significant a modification that we really cannot provide it, and then we would come up with alternatives, or we would consider whether the accommodation might be an undue burden because it is extremely expensive. So, for example, a sign language interpreter may not be necessary to complete an application to participate in an adult literacy program. So you see what I'm getting at is that it's all very situationally dependent. Depends on what's happening and what the accommodation is for. Okay, so let's keep all of that in mind, and that's the important part of providing accommodations at any level, in any type of program or situation, and that is that people have to be treated individually when they make that individual request. Slide 18, I believe, goes to effective communication and auxiliary aids and services. So moving right along here on providing accommodations, now we get to auxiliary aids and services, which really have to do with providing communication type of accommodations. You know, you have your physical type of accommodations, such as providing an accessible testing room, making, let's see, auxiliary aids and services, making materials accessible for people who are blind and visually impaired, providing a sign language interpreter, providing closed captioning for a large audience hall type of, web seminar, for example, where questions might be kept to the end. Well, maybe a sign language interpreter may not be the right thing to do. It might be better to do a closed captioner who puts up everything talked about by the lecturer up on a big screen for the hearing impaired person to read, essentially. But I want you to keep a couple of things in mind. When we're talking about effective communication, this is one of the most talked about issues that we get at the ADA Center. It's a very popular issue. We get calls about this all the time, every week. And essentially it has to do with the fact that sign language interpreting tends to be expensive. And what happens is that a lot of private businesses and private nonprofits essentially complain about the fact that it's so expensive, and yet here they are about to provide an educational program that's going to run for 6 weeks or 4 weeks, in which case they might be going to classes twice a week. So you're talking about, having a sign language interpreter in a classroom twice a week for 2 hours, for a whole month or maybe 2 months or even longer. So yes, it can get very expensive. But the ADA is clear. Essentially, the defense when the private business cannot provide the accommodation is that they have to say that they're either going to experience a fundamental alteration or an undue burden or both on the operation of their business or the program that they're operating. So we're going to get into that a little bit more deeper. Let's see here. So the next slide basically talks about preferences. The types of accommodations that people prefer. Okay, so you'll notice that entities are required to give primary consideration to the preference of the person who is requesting the accommodation. And that's going to be true in all cases. And it's really important that we understand this. One of the things I wanted to share with you is that there's an old national testing organization. It's a nonprofit. It's called the Law School Admissions Council. And the LSAC, they facilitate the LSAT exam for students who want to attend law school. And I want to mention to you that they've come into trouble with the Department of Justice because of this particular type of accommodation and the consideration of the preferences of the applicant. It's important because a lot of people regrettably tend to, quote unquote, pigeonhole people's disabilities. And that is a big mistake. It's a mistake because no disability is ever going to be the same. In other words, no person will ever be learning in the same way or the same fashion that other people who might have the same disability might be able to learn. So just because two people are deaf it does not mean that they necessarily might require a sign language interpreter. And the reason for that is because there are people who are deaf who do not use sign language. They use a different kind of communication mode or different kind of sign language. There are people who basically rely on American Sign Language, and so that's what they're going to request. You're also going to have people who are deaf and hard of hearing whose English is not their first language. English is more of a second language, and their primary language might be, for example, American Sign Language. So you have to keep these things in mind. But how? The how is that you don't have to know these things. What you have to do is listen to what they're asking you for. And that's where the consideration for their preferences comes in primary. That's why you have to listen carefully to what they're asking and why they're asking for that accommodation. Because once they disclose having a disability and they're asking you for an accommodation, the ADA door has been opened, and it's now for you fair and reasonable to ask questions, about the way that they study, or the way they participate, or the way that they read, or participate in the classroom. You can ask questions, like how do you, how do you participate? What's the best way you've done that? And so that's where the preferences come in. And the LSAT people, about 6 or 7 years back, I believe, were finally sued, and the Department of Justice finally stepped into the lawsuit on behalf of various college graduates who were wanting to go to law school, most of them blind or visually impaired. I believe there were other disabilities in play as well, but essentially became a class action suit, and the lawsuit ended up costing the LSAC people about $6 million, if I remember correctly, that they had to pay out for people in terms of their expenses and the loss of time and so on.
Okay, Diego, we got about 20 minutes till
the hour?
Till question. Yeah, it's 10 minutes till
questions. Okay.
10 minutes till 2. So.
Okay, good. Okay.
You want to continue one of the next two illustrations, or do you want to skip forward a bit?
Let's do illustration
5.
4.
4. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So a community civic association arranges to provide interpreting services for a deaf individual wishing to attend an adult literacy class at a local community center. The interpreting service requires the organization to provide payment in full prior to each class. Due to a personal emergency, the individual is unable to attend one class. The organization may not charge the deaf individual for the cost of the unused interpreting services.
Okay, so just understand that because the person who is deaf essentially might have gotten sick or something happened to them and they couldn't make one class, and the organization had to still pay for the interpreting service, that doesn't mean that they're not entitled to the service any longer. Basically, the Department of Justice sees this as the cost of doing business. And this applies to any Title III entity or Title II entity across the board, in that people with disabilities, if they miss using an auxiliary aid that's been paid for, so long as they had a legitimate reason for why they missed it, then it's a cost of doing business, and the entities have to keep providing the accommodation in the future. So moving on to the next slide.
We're going to skip.
We can skip illustration 5.
Go to the defenses.
Yeah, let's go to defenses.
Okay, next slide. Thanks.
So here we have the defenses. Now, you need to understand that these are called defenses. In other words, that is what allows either a public entity or a private organization a defense to say that they cannot provide an accommodation or an auxiliary aid or service, okay? Or that they cannot make an architectural modification to make a facility accessible, essentially because it might be so fundamentally altering to do so that it would fundamentally alter the nature of the program by taking away money that needs to go towards something important, such as running the program or maybe providing the X number of classes that were promised. And so, for example, let's say that a building has to be modified to make it accessible because it has no ramp access, okay? Then that means that if the contract or grant basically promises to do, let's say, 10 classes, and providing the building modification to make it accessible would reduce the number of classes down to 7 or something like that, that would be a fundamental alteration. Because not only would it modify the number of classes, but it would modify the educational program itself. And the organization does not have to redo its program, its educational program planning, because that would be a fundamental alteration. So let's move along. Then we have the definition of an undue burden. And you can read this. It's complicated. It's complex. But basically only complex from the standpoint that, it's a significant difficulty or expense. But then I put in here the test that you go through if you want to claim an undue burden as a defense for not providing a requested accommodation. Okay? And this would apply for having to decline to make a structural building modification to make a facility accessible. So the undue burden defense, this is the test for it. This is what you need to contend with and realize you have to meet these factors. And, these are not elements, they're factors. Doesn't mean that all of these factors have to apply. Just some of them or one of them would be your main reason why you may not be able to provide a requested accommodation or make a building modification. Then we have the definition of fundamental alteration on the next slide. Again, fairly straightforward. Understand, like I said earlier, that when a requested accommodation, stands to fundamentally alter the program, then they don't have to do that. And incidentally, this is what the law school people basically claimed, the Law School Admissions Council claimed, that making the types of requested accommodations for the students would constitute fundamental alterations of the LSAT exam. Well, the problem was that once the Department of Justice and their attorneys studied what they were talking about, they basically could not prove that that the accommodations would fundamentally alter the examination. And really what they were doing is essentially they were pigeonholing people with disabilities, particularly blind and visually impaired people. They were pigeonholing them into providing the same type of accommodation for all these different people with vision impairments. So, for example, they said that they only provided time and a half for the test. Well, that may not work for some people with disabilities or vision impairments. They might need twice or three times the amount of time. And that's what the problem was, is that they were not treating the accommodation requests individually. They were putting them all together in one basket, essentially. Illustration 6.
Okay, so an adult literacy program held at the place of a local nonprofit organization provides a sign language interpreter for one of its regularly scheduled classes. The availability of scheduled signed classes may be a factor in determining whether it would be an undue burden to provide an interpreter for a deaf person who wants to attend classes offered on a different schedule.
Okay, so I know that we're running out of time, but look at why I wanted to emphasize this particular illustration. You will notice how they provide the interpreter services, that they're basically scheduling interpreter services for one of their classes, but not all of it, for one of their scheduled regular classes, but maybe they have several scheduled classes throughout the day or throughout the week, and they're not choosing to provide interpreter services to all of them. They're just picking on one particular schedule. Say that each class that starts on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 9 o'clock in the morning, they'll provide an ASL person. So essentially, this would allow the entity to inform an applicant requesting a sign language interpreter that they offer, a class with ASL services on that schedule. Okay. Now, what needs to be realized here and understood clearly is that if there are no other deaf individuals attending that particular schedule, but the deaf individual who's applying to participate cannot make that schedule, then the entity will have to consider moving the sign language interpreter to the schedule that the person who wants to participate wants to apply for or participate in. Okay, sorry, that sounds kind of very, very convoluted. I apologize. It's kind of a salad of words there. But anyway, I think you understand what this means. Essentially, that this is one way to provide an expensive accommodation that won't necessarily be discriminatory, but that might alleviate the the budget of a nonprofit on a shoestring budget, essentially. Illustration 7 is fairly simple and straightforward. We don't have to read it necessarily. This is basically about, again, the undue burden and fundamental alteration defense.
Diego,
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt.
Sure.
We took that one out. We're going to save that for.
Oh, that's
two,
right.
remember?
Thank you very much for reminding
Okay.
me. Thank you again, Marie. Okay, Marie, thank you. Okay.
So we're at architectural barrier removal.
Yeah, so we'll cut through this pretty quickly. Architectural barrier removal. Understand that there's different requirements that apply. The requirement is slightly different between the architectural barrier removal requirement applicable to public entities, government entities, versus those applicable to a private entity. Okay, essentially, those of a public entity, a local government agency, they have an overarching obligation to make their services generally accessible throughout their entire program. So while they don't necessarily have to make every facility they might offer a particular service accessible, they need to make some of them accessible to make sure that everybody's included and able to participate in their programs and services. And as you can read on the slide, you see how the language goes with this. So the next slide is essentially more of the regulation in a different ways that the public entity can facilitate, accommodate people with disabilities in different ways in case they're unable to modify buildings or facilities. There's different ways that they could choose to, that they could opt to offer to provide services, programs, educational programs, and so forth. The next slide, we get to public accommodations and readily achievable barrier removal. Again, as you can see, this is pretty dense, primarily because you're looking at all the different factors and elements that go into being able to determine whether or not a barrier is readily achievable to be removed. In other words, without much difficulty or expense. Okay, so for example, in a building, in a two-story building, in an existing facility, two-story building, that there's no elevator, an organization would not have to install an elevator, for example, under the existing facility standard. Okay, that would be extremely costly, and it would be a significant expense, and so they would not have to do that. And that's, again, we're under the standard of, which is the lowest standard, by the way, in architectural barrier removal. Remember, we have new construction standards, which means that every facility newly constructed has to comply with ADA accessibility, architectural accessibility standards. And then you have below that, you have alterations of facilities that are being altered. So facilities being renovated, for example, all portions that are being renovated of any facility have to comply with the new construction requirements for barrier removal. Okay, and then the lowest standard, which is this one, readily achievable barrier removal. Now that's a mouthful. Applies to existing facilities not undergoing any renovation or facilities that have no plans of renovating or making any changes. Again, these are ongoing barrier removal requirements, and essentially a public accommodation can plan to do this in a span of time. They don't have to do it the next day they start running an educational program. They have to consider making a plan, putting it into writing, and then putting the plan into effect in terms of scheduling and the time when they're going to make, whatever portion is inaccessible, when they're going to make it accessible, such as installing ramps, making bathrooms accessible, providing handicap parking, restriping parking lots for accessible parking spaces. So all of the above would be under this low existing facilities standard. The next slide shows the priorities, basically, and you can see the priorities. And by the way, I want to remind everyone that I did look over the monitoring checklist from the Workforce Commission, and it's a fairly good document, I thought. So all these things are in that document. So just go through the document, and you will see what I'm talking about here on these slides, because it's essentially the same. This is the same discussion, only they have it in the checklist so that you understand that the barrier removal is required. They even mentioned the new construction requirement as well as the alteration requirement. So we get to this slide, the tension between Title II and Title III compliance. So what you're seeing here is some factors that I wanted to list for everyone to see with open eyes and understand that these tensions exist. They're not going away. And that, it needs to be clarified that the obligations of a public entity are typically higher in terms of ADA compliance and ADA accessibility. They're typically higher than those faced by public accommodations or a private business or a nonprofit organization. And because there's a contract or because there's a grant in place, then the public entity again has this overarching obligation to make sure that all of its operations, including its contracts and grants, are compliant with its Title II. Again, it's Title II obligations. Okay. In the meantime, of course, private entities still have to comply with Title III of the ADA and all of its requirements in terms of accommodations and as well as architectural barrier removal. So here we go to questions, I believe.
Okay, so this is Anne Marie, and I want to jump in and just encourage everyone that if there's a point in the PowerPoint that you want to go back and have Diego review, or you have questions, this is the time to ask them. And again, I've got several people that are watching the chat pod for me. So if there's questions, go ahead and type them in the chat pod or raise your hand to ask questions, because this is the time. Thank you.
Well, while people submit questions, so maybe we even if we don't have questions, I just want to go ahead and plug, shameless plug time, the Southwest ADA Center, which is a neutral, we're not a government agency. We're neither federal nor state nor local. We are a nonprofit. We are housed within the Memorial Hermann Healthcare System. It's the hospital. And so we're a nonprofit. And we are given a grant by the Department of Health and Human Services, the DHHS, federal, to basically provide education and training and provide confidential consulting, answer technical assistance questions about the ADA and any other applicable disability anti-discrimination law. That's what we do. We do it for free at no cost. And we have an 800 line, which is 800-949-4232. And then, of course, you can always email us through our website. And I believe that email address is swdbtac@ilru.org. And I'm sure it'll come up on this slide again. So, again, I'm not getting any questions. So what I'm thinking is, I want to mention that we are available for questions offline. You can always call us. Anyone who calls, their calls are confidential. We do not discuss them with your bosses or your organization or the people who give you money or the federal government or any type of, enforcement agency. We don't do any of that. That's not our job. Our job is to listen to your question and to give you as reliable as possible type of information relevant to your questions as we can give you.
Diego, we do
Yes.
have a question,
Sure.
and it is from Susan Sanchez. Thank you so much, Susan. And she writes, the question is, we have funds to pay an interpreter, but we cannot find one in our area. How do we handle this?
Yes, that's a very difficult question. Essentially, what the first thing to do would be to document. You need to document in writing. Remember that the regulations require that entities fully document why they are unable or they may be unable to provide a requested accommodation or auxiliary aid and service. So for your records, always prepare a memo that explains and delineates clearly why you may not be able to provide an accommodation despite best efforts, okay? So in a situation where you have no one available to do it, well, then there's no one available to do it. And you'll have to consider whether importing someone from the outskirts or from a city would be something that would be would be financially doable. If the organization decides that it's not financially doable, in other words, it would impose what? A fundamental alteration and or cause an undue burden on the operation of the program, then they don't have to provide that. They're going to have to decline that accommodation request, while at the same time try to work with the individual, explain the situation, and try to come up perhaps with an alternate method to provide that person some kind of participation, even if it means just giving them the material to work from and maybe perhaps providing them, making someone accessible to work with them one-to-one. So that could be a possible type of accommodation that will replace the sign language interpreter. But again, it may not be acceptable to the individual. And if the individual wants to file a complaint despite, your best efforts to explain this in detail and show why it would be so unduly costly and why it would be so burdensome to the program, no one can stop them from filing a complaint, in which case they will, if they really want to do that.
And Diego, we do have more questions coming in, and I wanted to thank Brianna. Brianna, thank you. Brianna sent this to me privately, and let me put this in the chat pod, and then we'll address it. Brianna addressed Susan's question. She said, the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf website should have agencies or freelance interpreters listed. Have you checked there as well? And I'll see if I can find that, Susan, and send it.
That's a good sharing of a resource, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then, okay, so let's go to the other questions because they are coming in. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so Amber has a question. From what I understand, if the site is already in existence, we do not need to bring it to ADA code, but only need to provide reasonable accommodations. Okay, Diego?
Yeah, let me clarify that. No. Let me correct you on that, okay? By ADA code, I presume you mean architectural accessibility of the facilities. Again, for existing facilities that are not undergoing any type of new construction or alteration. In other words, it's a building just standing there being used, okay? There is an ADA ongoing obligation since 1992. It's ongoing. It has never stopped. There is no grandfathering for any type of existing facility, okay? No grandfather clause. Essentially that they remove barriers where it is readily achievable to do so. In other words, without much difficulty or expense. But meeting that test is a bit tough, because what does that mean? That means that you have to consider the modification necessary, piecemeal, right? One by one, right? And then decide whether or not making the modification will fundamentally alter the program or cause such undue burden on the operation of the business that the modification cannot be made. In other words, it would be imprudent to undertake to do that if it's just going to fundamentally alter the program and take away the benefit that the program provides to other participants. So this is how you would do this. You need to sit down and do this on paper and reason out why you would be unable to make a structural modification to make a facility accessible. In terms of providing accommodations, that's a separate matter. You will provide accommodations to anyone with a disability who makes an individual request. But notice the difference. Requested accommodations are individualized. You deal with them with the person that comes with the disability, okay? The architectural barrier removal requirement is across the board, it's ongoing, and it does not require anyone to make a request of it. Big difference between the two, and thank you for asking the question, because it allowed me to say that in very clear terms, okay? So the new construction requirement applicable to anybody constructing a new building from the ground up, that applies regardless whether anybody requests that it be wheelchair accessible or not. Essentially, all facilities have to be wheelchair accessible, okay? The same thing goes for renovations. Nobody's requesting anything. If they're renovating, the portion being renovated has to be made accessible.
Okay.
And then again, for existing facilities, again, the bottom line being it's an ongoing requirement, and it's a readily achievable requirement.
Okay. And Diego, we have some excellent dialogue in the chat pod, and Brianna seems to be a valuable resource. She is an interpreter. She's actually an interpreter, and she says, I am a sign language interpreter. Because Beth Ponder in our office asked, can you use Skype or some other way to beam in the interpreter? And she says, I am a sign language interpreter. You can use video remote interpreter, but the Wi-Fi needs to be very good.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah,
right.
Typically that's just used until an interpreter can be located. So I hope, Susan, this is helping you.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I hope this is
and
helping.
I want to add a little something to that, Anne-Marie, and that is that I want to point out that the Department of Justice has gone after many types of organizations, including, like, say, large hospitals, for failure to provide a sign language interpreter during medical examinations or emergency room visits and so on. And a lot of those problems, believe it or not, have arisen because of really bad Wi-Fi connections. And so the relay service that goes through video relay really has to be, in other words, the entity, you guys have to check to make sure that it is fairly reliable.
One thing we may want to clarify, Diego, can you please clarify, you keep mentioning the Department of Justice. Can you please clarify for everyone who that is as far as where the complaint goes? Sure,
yeah. So basically what happens is that whether we're dealing with a Title II entity or a Title III public accommodation, anyone who feels discriminated against, they have the right to file a complaint directly with the U.S. Department of Justice ADA Division. That's ada.gov for anyone who may not know or be aware of the website. It's ada.gov, okay? That is the DOJ's division that handles all ADA matters and requirements, and there's where you find regulations and publications and guidances, and it's a really good website to have bookmarked on your browser when you want to read about any of these issues, because pretty much I can guarantee you they touched upon it all. You can even find current litigation briefs where you can read about who's being sued and for what under different categories, including education. So I encourage people to go take a look. I want to share that we have our own version of the readily achievable barrier removal checklist, and that's available at adachecklist.org. Okay, It is available in PDF, fillable format, as well as Word fillable format. You can download it. It's free, and it allows people to go through their entire facility when they want to create a plan of action in terms of making an existing or old building accessible.
And Diego, I want to jump in here for the sake of time. I know we have 10 minutes left, but Brenda, we have another question, excellent question. And one participant asked Brenda, she says, we have a person in our program who has seizures with a loss of consciousness almost daily. We feel the provision of medical staff on site is an undue burden, but we are considering that step. Do you have any suggestions? We have other modifications and accommodations in place. We have distance learning available, but we do not require it of this student.
You know, that sounds like a problem otherwise known as direct threat under the ADA. Under the ADA, it's not exactly square on with that type of defense. The ADA has other defenses that we did not talk about because, for the most part, they don't typically apply to the types of situations that we've been dealing with here on this discussion. But basically, there's a direct threat defense where the entity can go to the student and say, you know, you pose a direct threat. Well, in this case, it's not so much a direct threat, but it's a question of whether or not the person is actually qualified to stay and participate in the program. And by qualified, that means that if the person is having medical issues to such an extent that it is disrupting other class participants and is disrupting the program, then the entity may be able to claim that as a fundamental alteration of the program, and also point out, claim that the individual is really not qualified at this time to participate because they are in constant need of medical assistance. So again, what I recommend is that people sit down calmly and map this out in a clearly delineated written, record, a memo to the file, to consider all possible accommodations that could be reasonably considered that would not be fundamentally altering, and then move on from that standpoint. And if they find that there's simply, that there is no safe way to reasonably accommodate the individual, then they're going to have to issue a letter saying we cannot have you in the program, and then explain exactly why that is. And then certainly consider any type of other accommodation that could be made available, given efforts, to make it available online or allow the person to participate via Skype, even just telephone conferencing for that matter. So there might be different ways to accommodate the individual while, preventing them from being exposed to any further risk. Because what you got to realize is that the program itself, the educational program, the entity, is facing a little bit of liability here because they have to notify the individual that, they cannot be responsible because the person wants to attend the class if this person, is being harmed by being there, because they are, obviously the medical condition is not under control, and they have to be willing to point this out to the individual participant. In other words, all cards have to be put on the table. Certainly, I recommend that they do this in private, not in front of other students, and that they deal with this matter as confidentially as possible, so that everybody understands. And they might want to encourage the participant with a disability to perhaps come with a family member so that they're not alone during these discussions, so that they have someone they can rely on and be with, so that these things can be pointed out. And then maybe accommodations could be possible, and then again, maybe not. It depends on what's possible or what's financially, doable.
Okay, Diego, we have two more questions that have come in, and the first question is, Susan, we'll take these. I'm gonna give you both of them because I know I'm watching the time very carefully here. This comes from Miss Moya from El Paso, and she asks, if a person is enrolled and they are not taking their medications for bipolar or schizophrenia, what are our options? That's question one. The next question is, which is kind of in line with this, do students Do students have to have official documentation, or do they just request accommodations and modifications? So two
Yes.
questions.
Yeah. So let me answer the first one, the second question first, because it's easier. The second question basically has to do with documentation of a disability. The way you approach that is according to Department of Justice policy and guidance, basically, and that is that if the disability is not obvious, then the entity is in fair ground to request reasonable medical documentation from a licensed professional. Could be a counselor, could be a psychiatrist, could be an MD, primary care doctor, an eye doctor, but it has to be someone who's licensed to practice the type of medicine or help that the person needs in relation to their disability. So it can't be, that someone comes in with a cognitive impairment and they give you documentation from a chiropractor. That's what I'm talking about, okay? The two don't connect. So there has to be a connection between the professional who's providing the certification and the person's disability, okay? So that's one. And so documentation, again, if it's not obvious, you can certainly request documentation unless you have reason to believe the person is, of course, being earnest and they really have a disability because maybe it's known through other means, so maybe they knew each other from before. But yes, they can request request documentation. But again, reasonable documentation, not an entire medical record. I would never recommend that. Don't ask for medical records. You don't want to be getting into what people have in their medical records because that just imposes confidential, liability problems, and you don't want to get into that. So what you want is strictly legitimate, relevant documentation that makes a connection between the person's disability and the requested accommodation. Okay. The first part of the question, I'm going to begin to forget what it was now, Marie.
Okay,
Just remind me. Yeah.
Okay, yep, let me go back here. It's basically that if a person is enrolled and they're not taking their medication, and I'm going to maybe presume, Liz, that
Sure.
they're being maybe disruptive and they're not taking their
Yeah.
medications for bipolar or schizophrenia, what
There you go.
are our options?
Right. Yeah. So basically, thanks, Anne-Marie. Yeah. So basically, I was presuming the same thing, that they might be causing a disruption. Okay. Remember this: and people with disabilities can be excluded from participation. Excluded. Okay. In other words, removed from participation if they are causing such a disruption that no accommodation is reasonable. In other words, the disruption stays, and everybody's disrupted from participation. Then the organization does not have to put up with that. Okay, but again, they need to document this carefully and meet with the person, preferably privately, not outside the hallway, not in front of other people, but privately in an office with the door closed, and they need to explain that they are concerned that they are disrupting the class because of their behavior. And will the person consider doing something about their behavior, either tempering their behavior, or are there other issues that the person needs to address that they may need to take time off from school or from attending classes, in which case they can say, you're welcome to come back when you feel better, or once you've addressed your disability related issue, because it is so disruptive that we cannot permit you to be in the class. Okay, so this absolutely has to happen. Now, I would avoid getting into discussions with the individual. I don't care how well anybody knows people who come into a classroom, okay? Maybe they're like the old buddies from the old days or something. It doesn't matter. I would avoid telling people you need to go take your medication. That's not the concern of the educator or the entity providing the program, okay? The concern is whether or not their behavior is so disruptive that they have to do something about it. And that means that, yes, they can move to exclude the person, just do it properly, have the discussion first, and then make a final determination, and then you make it stick. You stand by it, okay? But again, I would not recommend anyone, asking people, so are you off your medication or anything like that? Because any comment like that could be deemed as discriminatory. That's why you want to avoid doing anything like that.
Thank you so much. And I want to As we wait, we have 2 minutes, and I was trying to type very fast in the chat pod. So instead, as you can see, because I'm making lots of errors here, instead what I'd like to just remind everyone is that there's going to be 2 more webinars that are 90 minutes each. Diego and Marissa will be back on March 22nd at 2 p.m. and then again on March 29th at 2 p.m. And Part 2 will go into reasonable accommodations in more depth, as well as more illustrations. And then on the 29th, Part 3 will go into a topic that has not even been addressed yet, which is the self-disclosure. When a student self-discloses, what are the steps? So I just wanted to remind everybody of that. Are there any other questions, and did we adequately answer the questions that came in? Because we have 1 minute.
Right. And if not, they can always, contact us online or send you the question, Anne Marie, and then you can forward it to us, whichever they prefer.
We still have a lot of people that have stayed on, and we so greatly appreciate that, Train PD. And I do want to just remind everybody of 2 things. This webinar will be available in the PD portal, and let me be clear on one point, and that is that there is going to be PD credit available for this webinar, but TWC has categorized it as the other category, so that will be up to director discretion. So I just wanted to let you know of that. And also, you'll be able to download your PD certificate for this webinar by tomorrow, okay? And then finally, I do know that several people were sitting next to somebody that has logged on, so thank you for letting me know. But if you are sitting next to someone and you did not actually register, or you do not have audio and you're not signed on to WebEx, if you registered but you're not signed on, I will not know that you're in this webinar. So you need to let me know by emailing me, or and I can put in my email here real quickly. Just email me and let me know that you did attend or you were sitting next to somebody. And I do know that Leslie Acevedo, Marisa Espindola, and Davina Williams are all in the webinar. So I do know that. So did I forget anything? Let me think. I do not think so. Oh, yes. And also, this PowerPoint will be available as an outline, as well as all of the great resources that we talked about. So I'm going to have the outline available for you, as well as a list of, the ADA technical manual that Marissa and Diego brought up. So I want to thank everybody. I hope this was helpful. Was this helpful? I want to make sure that it was. I hope so. Okay. All right. Wonderful. Wonderful. And I just want to go back to the front slide here so we can close. I apologize, everybody. I think this is very important. And we went too fast. All right. So on behalf of all of Train PD, I want to thank Mr. Diego DeMaya and Miss Marissa DeMaya for a wonderful webinar. Thank you both so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you for having us on here.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And I'm going to hold for just a few minutes because sometimes questions come in. But thank you both very much.